Okay, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nathan Altice. He's a teaching professor for computational media at the University of Santa Cruz, and I think he actually started there very recently. He has a number of research interests: history of computing, hardware humanities, platform studies, games and play, computing cultures, sound and synthesis. So he's looking very broad at things. And I think his talk today is, which is entitled No Generation, is kind of looking how both the consumer electronic press but also game historians look at the different generations of video game consoles and other technologies that emerges. Okay, so welcome, Nathan.
Thanks to Ingmar for hosting this morning, and it's an honor to be here to talk to you folks. If you know my name at all, which you may not, I wrote a book called I Am Error, which is a part of MIT's Platform Studies series on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And so it's probably no surprise that I'm really interested in the history of computing. But I thought after that book that I would maybe be moving forward in time, but I appear to be regressing and talking about even older things. And so today I wanted to talk about something that's kind of a new area of research for me that goes under this kind of slogan that I've adopted called No Generation. And it's really talking about some strategies for how to look at game history and through a very specific kind of framework. And the idea of where this title comes from is this generational metaphor that's been pervasive really in the history of technology and in the history of games specifically since the 1970s. So you're probably familiar, if you've ever gone to any consoles page on Wikipedia, that down at the bottom when they give you categories to look at, you'll have these generations that game systems are grouped into. So first generation being really the kind of pre-integrated circuit set of consoles, Magnavox, Odyssey, the Pong. It's basically clones of ball and paddle games that are usually using discrete logic to drive the games. Then your second generation is where you get into not only integrated circuits, but also cartridge-based media. In the 70s, they called this reprogrammable games. So the idea that you put a cartridge into the system means that you're reprogramming that platform to be able to play what they all said in the marketing was like infinite games, like you'll never need anything else other than an Atari 2600. And so on and so forth. We go to the third generation, which is kind of considered the 8-bit generation. That's when the industry really starts to focus on the bits, the number of processes that these microchips can do. And it creates these kind of interesting narratives where number one is it's a trajectory of improvement to where when you're going to first to second generation to third, you're always getting better. Like the consoles of the second generation are better than those before. And then the processing speed kind of falls away in later generations. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody refer to now as 8th generation. Like, do you have that new hot 8th generation PlayStation 4? But that is apparently the generation that we're in. So this metaphor has been really pervasive since basically video games existed in our kind of standard form. The problem with this metaphor, and metaphors always have particular constraints to them, is that you start running into classification problems. You have to start to do border work to figure out what counts as first, what counts as second, what counts as third. So if you go to something like this Encyclopedia Gamia, which I had actually not heard of, but this is just like one of the top Google results for video game generations, you start to run into phrases where they're saying, okay, we've got all the generations squared away, but we have to start to make choices about what counts and what doesn't. So you'll see sentences on that page that say, the generation it belongs in, or this is not included, or systems that toe the line. And strange things don't get included in these generations, like handheld games. They're considered to have their own kind of timeline that exists separate from proper consoles. And the other problem is that when you start grouping things into these categories, you start to pick winners and losers. And in America, there's no better way to pick out winners and losers than who makes the most money. And you start to get these rankings of systems. So we have, Atari 2600, which is 24 million units sold. And you might think, well, that's not really that big of a problem. But players start to internalize like the language of marketing, and they start to talk like they work for a marketing company. So they say like, oh, the Nintendo Wii U only sold 3 million units. They start using words like units that probably when you're just walking around your house, you don't talk about, units moved. So those become part of the kind of narrative of how game history works, is you go from one generation to the next, you improve, things get better, and then you have winners and losers, and you have things that count and don't count. So I was looking for a kind of nice way to sum up, like popular discourse drives, yada, yada, something academic. But I came across this historian of science and technology, Michael Mahoney, who had this great thing, which was hype hides history. Because the way that the stories of the history of technology are told, if we just rely on what's popular or what sells the most, it actually obscures history. What about the losers? Oftentimes, those are the more interesting stories. And Michael S. Mahoney, who passed away in 2008, I don't see crossover much in terms of people that are familiar with the history of games. I don't see him getting excited as much. He kind of came from history of science, history of technology, but a lot of what he says is really pertinent to what we're doing. And in this article, and I'll show a couple quotes from him, the histories of computings, that plurality is important, that there's multiple histories, multiple computings. So I know something firsthand about winners, and I don't mean that like immodestly, like because my book is so great. I mean that my book happens to be focused on a platform that was the winner of the third generation of consoles and is one of the most popular consoles of all time. There's something that a particular age group of people have an affinity to this system because, like me, they may have grown up with it. I actually grew up with Atari 2600, so slightly older. But this was the console that I really kind of imprinted on, that became sort of important, and that I kind of hung with throughout my life. But I talk about in one of the chapters some of the kind of nascent ideas that I'm talking about today, which is why do things win and lose and what gets to succeed? And the idea that some things within the history of computing belong to no generation at all. They're not first, second, or third. They're just these oddballs. But you notice this list is so extreme that it actually encloses a lot of different things that are important to the history of computing and to games themselves. And I think one of the biggest ones is personal computers. They don't really fit into the narrative of first, second, third generation. But they were vastly important to the way that early consoles and video games were shaped. And now we're seeing video game consoles kind of move back into being PCs themselves. So that's what's kind of driving this idea of no generation, is the things that don't fit and why it's important for history to look at these things and consider them to be important. So the reason I've kind of adopted this as a slogan that I said, and there's 3 strategies that I'm thinking about, and I really like when things begin with 3 of the same letters. So read, revive, and route, which I'll kind of explain in turn. And the first of those is to read the machine itself. And again, I'm going to go to Michael Mahoney because he's just full of great quotes. But he says, only by reading the machine can one appreciate the assumptions and choices that were built into it. And what I think is kind of profound about this is that this is 30 years before anything like platform studies or people really dealing with the materiality of like looking at the objects themselves rather than the screen or players. He was saying we need to read machines, and he thought this was important because he said there's a lot of work that gets made, a lot of technology that you can't learn from the texts that were written about those things. And he talks about boats, for instance. If you want to know what a boat is about, what it's made for, who it's made for, you don't look at a manual about boats. You look at the boat itself because it can tell you a lot. And he was saying this in 1980 when not a lot of people were really thinking this way. And in his article, the machine that he chooses to read is the Ford Model T. And he says this really interesting thing about, he says the only way to produce a machine in volume is to produce it by machines. That the essential meaning of the Model T, read as a technological text, it's a machine built by machines. Its design makes sense only if it's built by other machines. And he kind of walks through about how you can tell this by the individual parts, the machine as a whole. But you don't learn this by just looking at the biography of Ford or the manufacturing process. You have to look at the object itself. So the one thing I want to focus on today is the first console of the first generation, which is the Magnavox Odyssey, which came out in 1972, but it had this kind of long prehistory of a long gestation period of actually coming to market because there was no video game market. There was no industry. This was a completely new category of technology. So everything that it was doing was really new. It hadn't been seen before. So I want to show this promotional film that was sent out to department stores, Magnavox stores. Magnavox made televisions. There weren't like electronics stores in the early 1970s. Like you would go to a Sears or Montgomery Ward or something where you would also buy dishes or a lawnmower. You could get your video game and your television. So this was a film that was sent out. It's 5 minutes, but I think it's worthwhile to watch the whole thing and to kind of, if you're not familiar with the Odyssey, to get an introduction, 1972 style.
What does your family do on those stay indoors rainy afternoons or on those cold, blustery winter days? Families who are content to let television do its thing often find themselves at its mercy for a choice of entertainment, while people who want television to do their thing entertain themselves with Odyssey, the electronic game of the future, and the family's best follow-weather friend. Odyssey can be attached to any brand television receiver with a screen size of 18 to 25 inches, either black and white or color. And an ordinary screwdriver is the only tool needed to attach this Odyssey antenna game switch to the antenna terminals on the back of the television set. Once the antenna game switch is attached, you can select the TV position for regular television viewing or the game position for playing your favorite Odyssey game. Odyssey is played through an unused VHF channel of your television set. It operates on 6 common-size C-cell batteries, which come packed with the unit. Simply connect the game cord to the antenna game switch on the back of the set and to the master control unit. And plug the player control unit cords into their respective sockets on the master unit. And your Odyssey is ready to begin entertaining your family. Each Odyssey game uses one of these special game cards, plug into a slot at the front of the master control unit. The game cards activate lights on your television screen that bounce, float, or extinguish on contact, depending upon the particular game you've chosen to play. For example, to play Odyssey Tennis, you insert game card number 3 into the master unit. This activates 3 lights, 2 representing the players and 1 representing the ball. Press the special tennis game overlay into position on the television screen, and you're ready to begin an exciting, fast-paced tennis game. The horizontal knob on the left side of each player-controlled unit allows you to move your player light in a left-to-right or right-to-left direction. The vertical knob on the right side of each player-controlled unit lets you move your player light in an up and down direction. And the reset buttons on top of each player-controlled unit bring the ball back into play should it happen to go off the court. After you've learned the basics of the game, you can increase the challenge of Odyssey Tennis by increasing or decreasing the speed of the tennis ball with a special speed control on the back of the master unit. And when you want to razzle-dazzle your opponent into submission, a special English control, which fits inside the horizontal knob, will make that tennis ball do everything but stand up and talk. 12 different and exciting games come with your Odyssey, each following the same basic play procedures. In addition to Odyssey table tennis, other sport games include hockey, football, and skiing. For the youngsters in the family, there's cat and mouse, haunted house, and Simon Says. Rounding out your Odyssey game series are such challengers as submarine, roulette, analogic, and geography. Each Odyssey game comes complete with all equipment necessary for play, whether it's one of the 12 standard games or one of several optional games, which include a special shooting gallery, complete with gun and 4 target overlays. Depending on your hunting skills, you can choose between sitting or moving targets. Also available as an option is this special organizer case with separate compartments designed to hold all games and equipment. It makes setup a breeze and storage or moving of your Odyssey unit sheer pleasure. Odyssey can be many things to your family: fun, excitement, entertainment, challenge, and education. Why not take one home with you today? It's available only from the Magnavox salesman in the store. Odyssey, the electronic game of the future that lets you do your own thing on television, and only from Magnavox.
Yeah, so it lets you razzle-dazzle your opponents. So obviously, it's part of the challenge of history, especially with technology, is that that's incredibly hokey. It's incredibly limited. The overlays are silly. But we really have to think about, one, is how revolutionary this thing was. And it seems incredibly pedantic for them to walk through the steps like screw it into the back of your television, plug in the controller cords. None of that was known at the time. You had to be instructed for how to do that. But what does the Odyssey look like now? What is kind of the state of popular criticism, I guess I'll call it. And I always think YouTube, although it has its own implicit biases in how it filters search results, if you look for a review of the Odyssey, and we would probably have to unpack that word review, this is some of the top things that come up. And if you think, well, it's not really important, it doesn't have that much of an influence. I mean, look at the view count on number 2, 3,700,000 views. Ask any academic if they have ever had anything of theirs looked at 3 million times, and they would love to have those kind of numbers. This kind of stuff has an influence. And if you're not familiar with this guy, the angry video game nerd, he is largely responsible for this genre of angry reviews. So if you look up video games on YouTube, you have the poster of it, and it's usually somebody's face like contorted because they're mad about something. There's a lot of like 20, 30-something white guys that are apparently really angry about video games all the time. And this is from his review where, I kid you not, he has a what he calls cloned from his own shit, sitting beside him, playing the game with him. And I get that, you know, this is not supposed to be taken completely seriously, and apparently this is funny to a couple people, but some of the things he says have an actual impact on the way people think about games, especially if they're younger and they watch YouTube. And this is something that he said, primitive isn't even the word, it barely qualifies as a video game, you might as well be playing with rocks. And he's not alone. I mean, there's also, I guess, a subgenre where you're not angry, you're irate instead. So this guy who makes the faces into the camera, and you always have to have like the curated collection behind you to give you authenticity as a true gamer, that you have everything, so you're an authority and you can speak with authority. What does the irate guy have to say? I thought this was supposed to be a video game, not a board game. And there's part of these things that I agree with them, but I think for different reasons. So that has an influence. That Angry Video Game Nerd review of the Odyssey comes up a lot online if you're searching for the Odyssey. It's out there. A lot of times, if you were trying to figure out what the Magnavox Odyssey is, you would come across this video. Well, how does it look on the academic side or with scholars? And this is not to say this covers everything, but a kind of predominant narrative is this sort of patriarchal narrative of the great men who ushered technology into being. This is the creator of the Magnavox Odyssey, Ralph Baer, very innovative engineer. He worked for a military contracting company for several decades. He pitched the idea that came to him as millions of people have televisions. What if we could connect something to a TV and sell just a fraction of the amount of televisions that are in American homes? Wouldn't that be something? And over the course of about 10 years, put together a prototype that eventually became the Magnavox Odyssey. So you end up with Ralph Baer, who literally becomes the father figure of video games. And he starts to do his own kind of boundary work. He died just 2 years ago, but he wrote a lot about early video games. And he would say things like this. So Higginbottom was something that was discovered later as it was an early kind of analog oscilloscope version of a tennis game that preceded the Odyssey. So he was kind of, for a while, became the first video game. And Ralph Baer says, no, Higginbottom had invented a game, but it wasn't a video game. And it had nothing to do with playing games on the screen of a home TV. And this is from Ralph Baer's book. And it turns out that Ralph Baer has literally got to write his own history. He wrote his own book there on the left. And we have two kind of early academic video game texts. One, which is a visual history of a particular period of video game history. And Ralph Baer wrote the introduction. And in the medium of the video game, he was consulted and wrote the introduction. So he became an authority. And he leaves a lot of things out. Number one is the fact that he was the head of a team of engineers that helped him develop this thing, but he was taking a lot of the credit. And this is not to disparage Ralph Baer. I mean, he did absolutely fantastic work, very innovative, but there's a larger story to tell about the history of this thing. So to go back to Mahoney here, again, to reading the machine, what if we ask the artifact what it says about itself, rather than relying on the stories of the heroes, the people that kind of ushered things in? And there's a couple angles to kind of look at this, and one that I think is important is the way social configurations arose around the video game console as a part of the home. And I think this configuration, this is from the manual for the Odyssey, is really important, and it says a lot about, number one, the type of family. It's always one son and one daughter. It's always the husband and wife, usually with the same gendered kid on their side. It's usually the husband is like overseeing, like, the kids are playing a game, and the wife is looking at the husband instead of at the game. So he's kind of presiding over the play activity. The TV is the center point. But this new thing, this new interloper, this parasite of the television is something that's taken over. And I talk about this in I Am Error, about how when a video game moved into the home, the people that played it had to be taught everything about how to use that particular object. And so in marketing materials and in newspaper articles, you get repetitions of this configuration of people playing. And yeah, upper right, like, what's the wife doing? Like, she's looking at the dad, and he's like looking like this. And the kids are playing probably one of the worst games, which is like pick a state and say the name. Or you have this where the little girl has a hand on it, but no one is looking at the screen. And this kind of pervaded throughout marketing for games in the 70s and 80s. You would have weird contortions of bodies to make sure that you could see what was on the screen. And before you think like this seems really quaint and antiquated, this still happens today. If you watch the trailer for the Nintendo Switch, when a new kind of way of interacting with a machine is introduced, you have to be taught how to use that machine. And so we get demographically very different looking situations, but Nintendo is saying, these are the proper ways to use the machine. This is how it fits into your life. If we look at the actual internals of the Magnavox, it's a pretty fascinating machine. There is no integrated processor. There's no microchip, in other words. It's built from a series of discrete modules. And each of those modules is, if you took it out, has a little breadboard and some circuits that are attached. And they each perform a particular function that together forms this console. And I point out these four in particular because this is hardware that actually embeds the mechanics of the game into the hardware itself. And what I mean by that is today the way software development of games is done is the software controls what the mechanics of the game are. So if something shoots a gun, that's not that there's a gun chip that's built into the PlayStation 4, although I'm sure somebody's probably working on that idea. It's not that there's hardware that drives that, it's that software, the programmer decides. Whereas with this, one of the modules is makes the ball bounce when it touches the wall. It's actually driving the mechanic of the game. Another one, cause ball or player to disappear at coincidence. And what that means is collision detection, which is kind of the root of almost all gameplay, is when things collide, something happens. So the way that it internalizes mechanics, I think, connects the Odyssey in an interesting way to sports, to toys, and to games of chance, where the object of play itself embodies the mechanics of play. And the question that arises is, where is the game exactly? The game cards that you saw slotted into the machine in the front and actually turn the power on as well, these are not cartridges. They are basically jumper circuits that rewire those internal logic boards on the inside to create different configurations of play. So it might make the center line appear. It might make the two player spots appear on one side. It affects the way things collide. So you would use different game cards for different styles of games. And as the marketing video said, there were 12 games that came with it, but there weren't that many cards. There were 6 that came with it. And you notice the games don't have names on them. So you have this really interesting thing where how do you play the game of football on the Magnavox Odyssey? And from the manual, we can see these game aids that were attached to it that are required to play that game. So you have 2 different of the game cards. You have the overlay that goes on top of the TV. You have a game board that sits on the table. You have a scoreboard. Don't forget your roll of frosted tape, and you need a football token and a yard marker. You actually need dice as well, although it forgets to mention that. And then you have cards as well. So this configuration becomes some sort of interesting hybrid between it's a board game, but it's a toy, but you have a computer that's kind of mediating over the play experience. But the Odyssey, the hardware itself cannot enforce any of the rules. They are negotiated in the play experience between the people that are using the Odyssey as a machine. And so you're saying like, well, we're going to agree, like if we were playing schoolyard football, that if I cross that line, that's a point for me, and I need to write it down. There was no scorekeeping on the Odyssey. There was no other kind of display or graphics besides the spots that you saw on screen. So it raises what I think is kind of an interesting question about what is a platform exactly? Would this fit into the platform studies series? And I think a lot of folks would argue no, because what games can you make on top of these arrangements? There's a certain end limit to where it's exhausted. You can't reprogram the thing. You can only manipulate the materials that are already there. And you have to add all of these accessories to it. And so the Magnavox box came with all these different game boards. It came with poker chips. It came with cash with it as well. It came with dice, of course, batteries. So I think it kind of raises a question of like, what do we mean by a platform? And this is something that I raise at the end of the book, where I don't think a platform is so easy to pin down, to say definitively what is a Nintendo Entertainment System, what is a Magnavox Odyssey. I think that it's something that it's evolving as a kind of negotiation that's always subject to change, subject to translation. Step 2, second strategy, which is to think about how that platform evolves and to be able to revive media that's been lost. So the Magnavox is not the same thing as it was in 1972, but how can we make it something new? And part of the answer to that is what's called homebrew programming, which is basically hobbyists are interested in a particular platform and they will make new games using that old hardware. So the Nintendo Entertainment System has many people that make new games for it on cartridges. In the year of our Lord 2016, they still make a cartridge for a 30-year-old system. That's kind of interesting. And it's an excellent community, and it's a really interesting way to learn, but there's a small problem with homebrew, is that it tends to kind of participate in the same kind of nostalgic longing for something that has passed. It's not treating that platform as something that still lives. It's treating it as like, gosh, remember how great it was when we all just played Nintendo games and the games were so good then? No, they weren't. And they were so pure? No, they weren't. And they didn't have bugs. You didn't have to download software patches. They just left them broken. There's a kind of lens of nostalgia that's at play. So what you end up a lot of times with homebrew is you create these like alternate histories of like, wow, the Nintendo never had this game that I really liked. What if? And so this example is Pac-Man made for the Fairchild Channel F, which was one of the first cartridge systems. So it's like, I like Pac-Man. What if Pac-Man had been on this other system? And I don't think that's the only way to kind of look at how you can do work on these machines. What I find more interesting is projects like this. So this is the ODYSSEY, I guess is how you say it, which you can't exactly make an emulator for the Odyssey because it doesn't have a processor. There's parts of the internal hardware that you can emulate, but really you're more in the realm of simulation, making something that seems like it, that appears to be like it, without actually modeling the thing itself. And what this one person has done is they've created a Magnavox Odyssey simulator, which allows you to play all of the original games. You have overlays that are actually built in as like bitmap files that you can toggle on and off. It tells you what cart it uses. It even puts up this like faux wood grain 1970s TV, so I guess you have a more authentic experience or something to stare at the frame of a TV. But what's also interesting is at the bottom of this list, you'll see there are bonus games. And these are new games being made for the system, mostly by this author, but a few others that he's kind of acquired from people that around 2012 or so started looking at the Odyssey as a kind of target for a game design. And so this, MENTIS/Strike, is an Odyssey homebrew game, as strange as that seems, that the person actually produced a new game card, figured out a new configuration of jumpers that would produce new behavior in the Odyssey, and built a game around that, and actually made overlays and a game board and distributed it. This is another example, a game called Odyssey Evil, which they created the box for. There's an overlay, but there's no card. The entire game is figuring out how to use the existing hardware to create something new. And it's some sort of like seance game. They're hard to get. I think they only made 25 of them. But this is a way to treat a system as something that it still has the potential for game design. There's still a space to be explored there, and it doesn't even require traditional programming skills. And then one other fellow made these things called active cards, which was building a speaker, because the Odyssey has no sound, building a speaker directly into one of these game chips, and building a speed control. And this was in the late 2000s, and the person who did this was Ralph Baer, who revisited his own system and decided, what if I made new stuff and created new hardware for my old machine? So even he is kind of participating in this alternate timeline. Which brings me to the last idea here, the last strategy, which is to route new trajectories through game history. And a metaphor that I'm kind of borrowing here is to not use generations, but to use constellations. And I'm borrowing this directly from a German scholar named Siegfried Zielinski. Deep Time of the Media, if you're into media studies, is kind of an essential read. But he's talking about this metaphor of constellations, and he said, we'll encounter past situations where things and situations were still in a state of flux, where the options for development in various directions were still wide open. So he says that media is kind of this constellation. There's a way that I interpret it that Zielinski doesn't actually intend for, and that is as a piece of technology as a kind of center of gravity that attracts and acts as a locus point for a lot of different cultural forces that are both influencing it, and then when that artifact arrives, it influences back outward again. So the Odyssey is participating in a lot of different cultures. Of television is obviously huge, sports are obviously huge, board games, guns, because it's an American thing, so of course you have to have a gun attachment that goes with it. Military technology, retail, it has all these convergence of forces, and the scale isn't actually meaningful, the size of the circles, by the way. But then, as a platform develops over time, new constellations form. So we have collectors are now influencing what the Odyssey means. So there's this one guy on eBay. I've been trying to get an Odyssey, and he's buying all of them and making the prices like $1,000 instead of $200. So that guy's my enemy right now. So collectors have an influence on this stuff. Hobbyists, academics, the video game culture itself all kind of put pressure on what the Odyssey is. And really now it becomes more of a curiosity, a museum piece. It's not something that gets played as much anymore. The way that Zielinski is also kind of talking about it is the artifact as a kind of constellation of possibilities. And if we track these possibilities, we see that some, like branches from a tree, will kind of grow, change over time. Others will wither and fall away. So we have the master control unit, as it's called, very authoritarian name. That kind of industrial design has persisted over time. We still have these boxes that we put in the living room, although we don't like hover around them, we put them on the shelf. But those things have persisted. The controller, there's not really controllers that look like that weird Odyssey box anymore, but it has transformed and some of the same ideas are there. Overlays are something that seems like an anachronism now, but I'll get back to that in a second. Game cards was something that basically died as soon as cartridges came around. But the idea here being that what if we form these alternate trajectories? What if we follow the timeline through to see what game design would look like with these alternate possibilities, or if they had gone a completely different course? And one is, as I said, overlays. So again, with the Odyssey, these came in two sizes, two for each game. I guess you would only have like an 18-inch TV or a 24-inch TV. That was it. I think 24 was kind of like the upper limit in the 1970s. And you would slap these things on the TV, and that was your graphics for the game. It allowed you to create a kind of board game experience on the TV itself. And it's interesting to look at newspaper articles at the time as how they were trying to describe this. They were calling it like a playing field on your television. There wasn't a grammar to describe what these things were. But overlays actually have a really interesting kind of trajectory and history. You would see them in, like, for instance, the Intellivision, which was a second generation console, to use the metaphor that I don't particularly like. But these things would be fit over the controller, which kind of looked like a calculator keypad, which allowed you to reprogram the functions of the buttons for each game. And I think these things are actually really beautiful. They become a kind of part, a material history of that console and the way that it was played. The Intellivision unfortunately had like the worst controller. It was really difficult to use. But these are really kind of nice evolution from what the Odyssey established. And you see them recur with the ColecoVision. It had overlays, and there was like a re-release in a little tiny form, kind of like the Nintendo Classic that just came out. There was a ColecoVision flashback, and it came with overlays as well, which kind of a nice touch. You also saw it with this weird thing called the Vectrex, which was a video game that came with its own screen, which was really revolutionary at the time, and did not use raster graphics. It used vector graphics, where instead of tracing line by line, basically the cathode ray traces lines from point to point, kind of like the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator nowadays. There's an entire trajectory that you could follow with vector displays as well, and with tabletop style games. But the idea here being that the overlays go on the screen, and they actually had at the very bottom listed what the controller did as well. It arises in even more obscure places. You've probably never heard of the Emerson Arcadia 2001, but it was an actual thing that existed. And it's even hard to find decent pictures because there's not a lot known about it. If you go back to the Encyclopedia Gamia, this doesn't even show up on the list. So it's something that gets overlooked. But it was a console that used overlays as well. If you recognize this, then you should probably come talk to me after the talk, because we probably have some things to chat about. This is the Radofin Advanced Programmable Video System from 1976. It's rarely known because it basically existed in Europe, and it was cloned in multiple regions. I think there's like 30-some clones of this thing everywhere but the United States. It used overlays as well. And you might be thinking, well, this is something that surely died in the 1980s. Not so. Atari Jaguar used overlays for its controller, slightly obscure 32-bit system that had these terrible controllers that you put these overlays on top of. Well, maybe it's just for games. Well, no. Synthesizers use overlays as well. So this is the Microbrute by Arturia. This is a new synth that you can still buy. It's an analog synthesizer. It comes with a package of presets, which are overlays that you put over the knobs, and you twist the knobs into place to get the sounds that are described on the overlay. And then it has some that you can write on to create your own presets. The OP1 synthesizer by Teenage Engineering comes with, when you get it out of the box, this overlay that describes the functions of the different keys. If you've ever had someone that is in production and works with Final Cut, you'll see overlays for keyboards like this. And the idea is not to just say, well, like, look at all these things, aren't they interesting? It's really to follow these trajectories through to see what kind of design space they allow for, because it turns out these things continue to pop up. What does the overlay look like in 2016? Well, Apple says that it looks like the touch bar at the top. It's now digitally driven, and it can change rather than having to manipulate an actual thing. So to kind of wrap up, I want to mention one other scholar who I really like the work that she does. She did the tiny little sliver of artwork that's on my book, and I felt bad for reducing it to that small. But Rachel Simone Weil, she is an artist, programmer, and an academic. And she gave a talk 2 years ago called No Bad Memories. See, I even stole the slogan idea from her. But the idea that the video game industry and gaming culture really relies on what she calls prepackaged nostalgia. Like, oh, remember the Space Invaders? Oh, remember Super Mario? Isn't that great? Doesn't it make you feel good? And if you don't share those feelings, it makes you feel like kind of an outsider, like maybe you didn't grow up with Super Mario Brothers. Maybe you don't care about Space Invaders. Maybe you played completely different types of games. And so one project that she's done is called Famicom, which is a play on Famicom, the original name of the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan, which she calls the Feminine Computer Museum. And what she's doing is curating and collecting these games that were marketed specifically for girls. And there's a huge prejudice against these types of games. If you go to like IGN or any other kind of popular game review site, try and find a review of like Style Savvy or a My Little Pony game. If they do review something like that, it's kind of like snidely put aside as, oh, this is something for girls. And she is really celebrating this alternate history of what if we embrace the aesthetics of these super feminine games and collect them together? What kind of history can they teach us about within games? I am working on my own project right now that should be launching in January, which is pre83.com. And I am looking at some of these neglected consoles and platforms that happened before 1983. Why 1983? Well, it's kind of arbitrary, but it's personally relevant to me because that's when the Nintendo Famicom launched. And that's sort of where I had defined my timeline of video games. And I'm interested in the things that happened before that, that led up to that system. And especially interested because I have no nostalgia whatsoever for those old things. I don't look at them and say like, oh, I remember when I played those. I don't. And for a long time, I thought they were like not really worth my time because they're so primitive. Because it's just a few shapes. There's only so many games that you can play. But it turns out that there's a kind of amazingly rich history that occurred before the third generation came about. And the idea is to collect resources, programming resources, to make these things living platforms. So just to bring it full circle to close with Michael Mahoney, I think this is really important to keep in mind. The activity's choice of historical models is itself part of the history of the activity. So the way that we do history creates that history, and the things that we choose to include or exclude are shaping the history of those things themselves. Thanks.